Okay, so let's move on to chapter 6. We're going to move a little faster after this one. Chapter 6 is entitled Human Fallibility. Let's see. He quotes Paul, "The evil that I would not, that is what I do." Paul writes that in Romans chapter 7. Christian fallibility, Christianity and human fallibility. And he goes into a whole host of Western ideas that he connects to that idea. First, I want to point out a couple of things about the difference between the biblical view and the view that was common at the time among Greek philosophers and Romans at the time Christianity came into the world. Plato, who was the first major Greek philosopher, believed that people act in immoral ways because they're ignorant of what's right. In other words, he ascribes evil to ignorance. If people were informed properly, they would act properly. When I read that, I thought about the fact that in the early church, we're talking about the 2nd and the 3rd century AD. There were 3 forms of the Christian faith. I'm not going to deal with one of them. One of them was called Ebionitism. That was a Jewish form of the Christian faith that eventually died out. But the 2 major ones were what's called proto-orthodoxy, which is what we understand as the heart of Christianity today. And then there was Gnostic Christianity. And Gnostic Christianity believed the same thing that Plato did. According to Gnosticism, human beings have fallen from the spiritual realm into the material world, which is a form of a prison. Your body is like a form of a prison, and the point of salvation is for your soul to escape the prison of your body and return back to the spiritual realm. And the way that happens is through gnosis. That's a Greek word that means knowledge, okay? And their idea was that Jesus was someone who came into the world in order to impart the proper knowledge so people would know the right things that would enable them to eventually escape this prison of the material world and ascend back into the spiritual realm where they belong. Okay, so proto-orthodoxy, on the other hand, the Christianity that survives as the Christian church believes that evil and immorality is not a problem of ignorance. A lot of people know what the right thing to do is, but they don't do it. I can tell you that from experience. So the Christian view is that evil or immoral behavior It doesn't have to rise to the level of what we call evil, just, harmful behavior, harmful to yourself and harmful to others, is a problem of the human will, not a problem of being ignorant, okay? There are a lot of people who are not particularly ingenious in their ability to think and understand, but who are very saintly in the way they live. And there are a lot of people who are extremely intelligent who do very evil things. So for Christianity, the problem of evil is not a matter of ignorance, it's a matter of the human will. Of course, the biblical story to which we trace that idea is the story of Adam and Eve in the garden, and the fact that they were tempted by the serpent to do the wrong thing, even though they knew what the right thing was. In other words, the serpent was able to con them into eating from the tree of the fruit of good and evil, even though God had said you can eat of any tree in the garden except this one. But they did it anyway. Okay, so the biblical view is that the problem of human evil is a matter of the human will being bent in on itself. Okay, now, but the book of Genesis does not simply describe human beings as creatures who are prone to doing evil. The creation stories also say that human beings were created in the image of God. In the image of God, God created them. Male and female, he created them. Okay, so you've got this kind of dichotomy in the Bible between the dignity and the worth of human beings being created in the image of God, and the fact that the human will has somehow or another been corrupted. It's been corrupted such that even though we know oftentimes what the right thing to do is, we do the wrong thing anyway for any variety of reasons, most of the time out of self-interest. Okay, so what D'Souza does in this book is he looks at that dichotomy. Number one, that human beings are prone to doing the wrong thing, but number two, that human beings also, each and every one of us, have the same moral worth in the eyes of God as anyone else. In other words, the idea of the equal moral worth of all human beings. No one is better than anyone else in the eyes of God. In the eyes of God, all people are of equal value. Okay, so if you look at the ministry of Jesus, for example, and you compare that with the stories of heroes in the Greco-Roman world, what you will find is that the stories of heroes in the Greco-Roman world, and of course the most famous of the books in this regard is Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. I don't know if you've read those. I had to read them for a book on ancient literature in college. The people who are celebrated are the people who are strong, the mighty, the warriors, the Achilles of the world, the people who can, overcome other people, who are stronger than other people, who are able to win in war, who are able to rise above and somehow or another achieve things that are much more impressive than other people do. Well, the Greeks are getting at something there, but they're coming to the wrong conclusion about it. What they're getting at that's true is that not all people are created equal in the sense of equality of ability, okay? Some people really are smarter than other people. Some people really are stronger than other people. Some people can be football players. Some people can't. Some people can be scientists. Some people can't. Some people can be fixers. Like, we have an old house. It was built in 1957. So we're having issues with this house all the time. And when it comes to fixing things, I'm just totally out to lunch. So I have to hire people, to come and or find a friend who's willing to, to fix whatever's wrong. So in that sense, what they're saying is correct. We're not all equal in terms of our ability. But where they're not correct is that means that those who are better at, who are stronger physically or smarter intellectually or, whatever it might be, where they're not correct is that confers value on them as human beings. What confers value on us as human beings from a biblical point of view is the fact that we're all created in the image of God. So even though there is inequality of ability, there is not inequality of value. So, for example, if you came across, God forbid, a terrible car accident of some kind, and the person who was injured in the car accident was some famous celebrity, everyone would want to, help this person and make sure that this person was taken care of. And then you came across a car accident where it was just a common everyday person, like most of us are. It would be, from a Christian point of view, it would be sinful to treat the celebrity differently from the common person. Okay? So that's the point that he's wanting to make there. The equal worth of all human beings. And when you compare the Greco-Roman world to the Christian church, which developed in the midst of this particular culture, and you see the extreme differences in the values between the two, you can begin to get a better idea of how it is that Christianity in particular, as a religion, shaped the values of the West, okay? Because the values of the West, by and large, mirror the values that were embodied in Christianity, over time. So, for example, in early Christian communities, this is particularly clear in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. Corinth was a port city. It was a big city, and because it was a port city, there was a lot of trade going on. There was, shipments of grain coming in and shipments of other things going out, and so you had a wide diversity of population in the city of Corinth. You had everything from slaves to people who were extremely wealthy merchants. Okay, now, in the Church of Corinth, because there was this wide range of diversity among the population, when the Christians met for what they called agape meals, they would have, agape is a Greek word for love. They would have these meals together where they shared and celebrated the love of Christ. Okay, Paul castigates the wealthy members of the church because they brought this lavish amount of great food to enjoy, and the poor would show up with little or nothing, and they weren't, and the rich weren't sharing what they had with the poor. So Paul castigates them because, as Paul points out, in the community of Christ, we treat each other all the same. We don't observe these hierarchies of value and importance that exist in the rest of society. The Christian church is to be different. It is to reflect the values of Christ. Okay? And as we all know from the Gospels, who is it that Christ, for the most part, associated with? Well, he would go from village to village. He associated with the poor. He gathered with the tax collectors, with the so-called sinners, with the sick, with people who were in need. He gathered with the common people and the people who lived on the margins of society. And the reason he did that, or one of the reasons that he did that, was because to him, people who were treated as if they had little or no value needed to understand that in the eyes of God, they were every bit as much of value as anyone else was. And so when 5,000 hungry people come to him, what does he do? He feeds them all. He doesn't leave some out and feed only his favored few. He feeds them all. Or when sick people come to him, he doesn't ask them first, have you been observing the Jewish law as you're supposed to? Uh, he never does that. He simply heals them. He treats everyone equally with compassion, with love, and with a view to having them understand that God's intent for them is not judgment, but it's redemption. Okay? So he wants people to understand that he has come into the world not for the sake of condemning the world, but in order to save the world, which is a quote, of course, as you might recognize, from the Gospel according to John. Now, according to D'Souza, there are a number of Western institutions that were shaped by this particular perspective. And he discusses this by comparing it with the way in which these institutions were practiced in pagan societies. So one of the first issues he takes up is the issue of marriage. Okay. Marriage back in the ancient world was not thought of as something where two people come together in love and by mutual consent make vows to be faithful to each other until death do us part. That was not the idea. There were various ideas of marriage, but that wasn't one of them. For example, Plato had absolutely no respect for marriage at all. He believed that children ought to be raised by the state. And the reason he thought that is because he believed that the state, acting through properly trained teachers, could raise children to be enlightened citizens, whereas common everyday people like the farmers or the sheep herders or the laborers, these were not people who were fit to raise children, because all they would be doing is passing on their own ignorance to their children. So for Plato, he didn't think very highly of marriage, and he thought children ought to be raised by the state. Marriages back in the ancient world were arranged by the families. The families would decide in advance, whether their son or their daughter was going to marry this person or that person. And it was based on, of course, it was based partly on class. You had to marry within your own class. If you were a wealthy person, you would never allow your son or your daughter to marry below you. You had to find someone who was from the same class. That's just one example. But marriages, by and large, were arranged. It wasn't a matter of a couple coming together, falling in love, and deciding to get married. In fact, this isn't quite the same thing, but my son Eric, who spent about 3 years living in Hong Kong, when he was going to school, high school in Castro Valley, he had a friend who was from Hong Kong, and excuse me, his mom and dad won one of these lotteries that I don't know if the U.S. still does this for immigration, but they used to have immigration by lottery. You know, whoever won the lottery got to immigrate. Okay, so his parents won one of these lotteries and they immigrated to the United States. And his friend never met anybody that he felt was, in fact, his way of thinking about marriage wasn't that he should be looking for, you know, someone, you know, in the community that he might, you know, discover as a possible life partner. To him, marriage was something that was largely a family affair. So the way this worked was his father had a brother who got wealthy over in China when China, you know, changed its economy to a capitalistic economy, and he had a daughter, and so this guy suggested to Eric's friend's father that maybe his daughter would make a good wife. And so that's how that marriage happened. It was arranged by the family. And so what he had to do was, first he had to go all the way back over to China and get married. Okay, he was a Hong Kong citizen, so he could get married over there, and then they had to wait. I don't know. It took like a year and a half before this young gal was allowed into the United States. They had to, you know, the issue was, is this a marriage just in order to get somebody into the country, or is this really a bona fide marriage? Okay, so they finally decided this was a bona fide marriage, and just recently she made it into the United States from China. Okay, so marriage was, you know, largely something that was an arranged affair. But over time, in the Christian West, marriage began, and you can see this even in the letters of Paul, where in Ephesians Paul says that husbands should love their wives as Christ loves his church, and so forth. You can see a new way of thinking about marriage emerge. And eventually, especially when the church decides that marriage is actually a sacrament, is something through which, you know, God's grace is poured out on the bride and the groom, so as to, you know, bind them together and enable them to fulfill their vows. Marriage began to be thought of first of all, as a partnership between a man and a woman, both of whom had to have mutual consent. In other words, the family didn't decide, the bride and the groom decided. Okay. And this idea of courtly love that developed in the Middle Ages, where people would fall in love, that also became a part of what people thought of as marriage. And then finally, the reformers, like Luther, for example, said that marriage was actually a calling. In other words, some people are given the ability to be celibate, and if so, Paul actually says the same thing. Paul says, I prefer, to be single, but he says, if you can't control yourself, then it's better that you get married than not. So marriage was thought of as something that was an institution that where two people came together by mutual consent, and it was not only for the raising of children, although it was for that too. Obviously, it was for procreation. It was for the raising of children, but it was also considered a blessing for both the bride and the groom to have a life partner. And you can actually go all the way back to the book of Genesis once again, where in the second story of creation, where remember Adam says to God, after he names all the animals, he says, well, this is fine and good, but I don't have a companion fit for me. And so God, creates woman, and then the text says, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one. Okay, so marriage as we understand it in the West, as something of mutual consent by two people who fall in love and decide to spend their lives with each other, is a Western idea that came from the Christian faith. Okay, the next issue he gets into is the issue of politics. Okay, how has the Christian faith influenced the way we think about politics in the West? Okay, well, what I'd like to do with this is refer in particular, because we're all familiar with that, refer in particular to our own Constitution, because our own Constitution is a good illustration of how Christianity had a big impact on how people in the West think about the use of political power. All right, now it wasn't always this way in the West. For many, many centuries, countries were ruled by monarchs, kings and queens and so forth. But over time, and as people began to understand the implications of what the Bible, was saying about human fallibility and the fact that given the chance that human beings oftentimes act in ways that are harmful to others, the idea arose that the best way to deal with political power is to divide it up so that no one aspect of a government has all the power concentrated in it. So, for example, in our Constitution, we've got three branches of government. We've got the president, who is constitutionally, his job is to enforce the laws, right? He doesn't pass laws. He's a part of passing laws. He has to sign them. But Congress can, override if a president vetoes a law, Congress can override the president. So the president's job is to enforce laws. The job of Congress is to make the laws. Okay, and the idea of a representative government, okay, and that's what we have. We don't have a direct democracy. A direct democracy is where every citizen participates in the making of the laws of the land. Well, in a big country, you can't do that. That's not possible. In the old, if you go way back in American history, especially to the towns in New England, they practiced direct democracy. All the citizens would gather together, and they would vote in the laws that the town would have to abide by. But we have what's called a representative democracy. Therefore, what we do is we elect representatives in the two houses of Congress, and they make the laws, okay? And both houses of Congress have to pass the same legislation for it to become a law. What happens most of the time is that the House of Representatives will pass one bill, the Senate will pass a similar bill, there'll be differences. So then what they do is they put together a committee on reconciliation, and the reconciliation committee reconciles the differences between the two bills, which requires compromise, okay? And the whole idea behind that is that when when a government needs to compromise in order to pass legislation, that means that power is being diffused. It's not being concentrated in any one entity, like a king or a dictator or something like that. Okay, so once the bill is reconciled, then it goes back. If both houses of Congress pass it, then it goes to the president. He signs it. Now you've got a law. Some people, and I went to school over in Europe when I was in college, and some Europeans would make the observation that American democracy is unwieldy because it takes so much time to pass a law, because you have to go through all of these steps before something can actually become a law. Well, they have a point there, But you know, the founders of this country actually wanted it that way because they believed that nothing should become a law unless it had overwhelming popular support. So if you have something that has overwhelming popular support, then you're going to have, your representatives working together. That's the theory anyway, working together to make sure it happens. Okay, and then the third branch of government is the courts. And the court's job is to determine whether or not a law that is passed is actually constitutional or not. Okay? Now, that brings up another important issue about Christianity's influence on how we govern ourselves. All right? If you read carefully the Declaration of Independence, what Thomas Jefferson wrote was, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." In other words, you don't have to prove them. They're obvious to everybody as being true. All men are created equal. All human beings are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, now what's important about that is that this idea that government is limited by the rights that are given to us by God is a new idea. Okay, that wasn't something, that was something that came from Christianity. The idea is that there are certain rights that all of us have that aren't given to us by government. They're given to us by God. So government's job is not to confer rights on the citizens. Government's job is to protect those rights and to make sure that no one violates those rights. Okay, so that's where we get this, what we call the Bill of Rights and the other amendments to the Constitution. These are considered to be rights that everyone has in virtue of having been created equal by God, and government does not have the power to violate those rights. All right, so the reason we have a court system is to make sure that government does not, that the legislative arm of government does not pass a law that violates one of those rights. Okay, so in short, then, what this ended up becoming is a representative democracy where power comes from, this is the theory anyway. We know that it doesn't always work this way. All right. But in theory, the legislature is answerable to the people. Unfortunately, in many cases, the legislature, because they need money to run their campaigns, oftentimes become answerable to their donors rather than to the people. That's one of the flaws in our system that I personally think needs to be corrected. But in any case, the idea is that power comes from the people. We elect representatives to make our laws on our behalf, and we elect a president to enforce those laws. Now, the reason that the one of the problems that has happened in America is that the presidency has began to become much more powerful than the founders ever thought it should be. And the reason for that is that so many laws and regulations and things were passed, and I'm not suggesting that many of these weren't necessary, many of them were, but so many of them were passed that the president now oversees the enforcement of so many laws that he needs, 20 or 30 cabinet members around him to make sure that all of these laws are enforced. And on top of that, if Congress doesn't do something that a president wants, okay, what the president can do is sign an executive order. And an executive order, in theory, is an order that is intended to enforce a law that is already in existence. It doesn't create a new law, it enforces a law that's already there. Okay, so that's the theory. So if you look at this system, you can see how the founders thought of human nature as being fallible. And because it's fallible, you do not put all of the power into any one aspect of the government. You have checks and balances. Okay, you have a president who enforces laws, you have a legislature who makes laws, and you have a court that interprets them. And they check and balance one another to make sure that the rights that we have been endowed with in virtue of having been created in the image and likeness of God are not violated. All right. So that is the second aspect of what D'Souza goes into in this particular chapter. Now, I'm just about out of time, so I'm just very briefly going to mention what he says about economics and the concept of progress. Many people look at capitalism and they say, how can you reconcile capitalism with Christianity when the whole idea of capitalism is the drive to become wealthy, right? That's what it's about. Entrepreneurs either invent products or they take products that, in the case of my brother, he was a CEO of a company. He took a product that had already been invented and he created a market for it. Okay, it was a portable diagnostic machine that enabled people to do blood tests on site. You didn't have to take a blood sample and send it off to a lab. You could do the blood test right there on site. Okay, so some of his customers were the military and veterinarians and people who needed to do blood tests and get the results quickly. Okay, so he took this product, he marketed it, and he made the company successful. And you could say, well, he did it because he wanted to serve the community. And in the case of my brother, that's true. He did want to serve the community. But the capitalistic system is that the people you're serving is not your customers, although inadvertently you're serving your customers because they're benefiting from your product. But who are you really serving? You're serving your shareholders. That's who you're serving. Your shareholders put money into the company so that they can make more money. That's the way the system works. All right. So what D'Souza points out is that what capitalism is a system that channels the human drive to acquire more and more and more in a way that benefits everybody. So, for example, a company comes up with a new product. The product is very beneficial to the consumer. The company becomes very successful. It earns a lot of money. The shareholders earn a big return on their investment. And the customers benefit from having purchased the product. Okay, so what's happening is that the human drive to become more and more wealthy is actually inadvertently helping the entire society. Okay, and the best example of where this has happened recently, of course, is in China. Prior to the reforms that were made in the Chinese economy under Deng Xiaoping, you remember him? Deng Xiaoping was the guy who introduced capitalism into China. China is now perhaps the biggest economy in the world. We're not sure. But that's because they introduced this particular system into their economy. And that's how China got richer. And in fact, you might be interested in knowing that because of the capitalistic system of producing wealth, the poverty rate, according to the UN, the poverty rate in the world is lower now than it's ever been in human history. It's lower in India by leaps and bounds. It's lower in Africa. It's lower in Latin America. It's lower everywhere. Because entrepreneurial capitalism, which is in a sense very self-serving, nevertheless benefits everybody because it produces more wealth, employs more people, and enables more people to have the money they need to purchase the products that keep them out of poverty. Okay, I'm out of time. Are there any questions or comments on anything that I covered today?
You know, in your summary, the last, thank you very much for the lecture today.
Yeah.
But it also produces things that people need.
Yes, it does. Yeah, it does. Yeah.
And maybe maybe that's a driving force in the initiation as well.
Yeah.
Besides personal greed for
Yeah.
the people that are doing it.
Well, David, I think you bring up a very important point. I think a lot of entrepreneurs are in it because they want to produce something that is beneficial to people's well-being rather than being in it just to make money.
Okay.
I think point well taken. Yeah. I think that's true. Yeah. Thanks a lot, everybody, for tuning in. I really appreciate your willingness to listen to me bloviate for an hour. Next week, we are going to cover the next 2 chapters, okay? And we'll move along a little more quickly.
Okay.
So
Okay.
that's chapter 7 and chapter 8.
That's correct. Yep.
Cool.
Okay, take care, everyone.
Okay, thank you.
See you next
Okay.
week.
See you next week.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.